On a backcountry Kentucky road, Mason Vale found a crumpled SUV bleeding smoke into the evening air, a woman unconscious in the roadside grass, and 4 open suitcases scattered across the gravel. $10 million in banded cash lying in the dirt. He was a broke single father 2 weeks from losing his garage, and every debt he owed could have vanished with one reach. Mason didn't touch a dollar. He pulled the woman clear, called for help on a dying phone, and stayed until the badges arrived. 3 days later, men in suits showed up at his shop. They didn't ask about the woman. They asked what Mason had taken from the money. Stay until the end to find out what Mason carried away from that wreck, and why an empire came hunting for it. Mason Vale's tow truck had more rust on its frame than book value, and he drove it back toward Vale County Auto and Recovery that Tuesday evening with $43 in his pocket and a fuel receipt that told him he had nearly spent more getting to the last job than he had earned from it. The bank notice sitting on his workbench said what he already knew: $62,000 due before the end of the month, or the garage doors would be padlocked by someone who didn't care that he had built the place from a concrete slab and a used floor jack. His daughter Sadie, 16 and quieter than she used to be, was staying with her aunt across town because Mason couldn't ask her to sleep above a garage that might not be his in 2 weeks. He didn't call to explain all of that, because he couldn't explain it in a way that didn't make him sound defeated. And he was trying very hard not to be defeated. The drive back to the shop was the same rural highway he had taken 100 times. 2 lanes cutting through flat farmland with drainage channels on each side, and the occasional reflective marker catching his headlights. And Mason drove it the way he drove everything, measured and precise, watching the shoulder the way he had learned during his years doing roadside recovery work. He saw the skid marks first, long black lines biting into the asphalt before they veered sharp right, the way a car moves when brakes engage but something overrides the steering. Then he saw the gap in the wooden rail fence, splinters still pale against the weathered boards, and below the drop-off the rear end of a black SUV nosed into the drainage channel with the front end crumpled against the opposite bank. Mason pulled over, grabbed his roadside kit, and went down the embankment at an angle, keeping his footing on the wet slope the way he had done maybe 200 times before in similar conditions. The driver's door was hanging open and the seat was empty. He found the woman about 15 feet from the vehicle, lying on her side in the grass with one arm folded under her and a cut across her right temple, still tracking a dark line toward her jaw. She was breathing, and her eyes were open but unfocused in the way that told him she had taken a blow to the head and her nervous system was still catching up with events. He ran his hands along her neck and spine the way his first aid certification had taught him, checking for the wrongness that would mean he should not move her, and finding none of it. He stabilized her shoulder with the materials in his kit, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and understood that speed and steadiness were the same thing under pressure. It was only then that he looked up and saw the suitcases, 4 of them, 2 resting in the grass and 2 that had skidded further down the channel, all 4 with the latches broken open. Banded currency lay fanned across the gravel in amounts that his mind could not immediately calculate, and he stood there for exactly 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds he understood with complete clarity what the money could do for him. The bank debt, the garage, the apartment above it where Sadie could come home, all of it resolved in one quiet decision on a road where nobody was watching. He turned back to the woman, knelt beside her, and applied pressure to the cut on her temple. He used the last 4% of his phone battery to call for emergency services and read off the highway marker number from memory. The woman gripped his wrist and said something in a low, strained voice, two words that Mason heard as the lock, and he assumed she was asking about her car, the same reflex he had heard from 100 accident victims who wanted to know if their vehicle was going to be all right. When the sheriff's deputies and the ambulance arrived, Mason gave his full statement, handed over his contact information, and declined the deputy's offhand remark about a Good Samaritan finder's fee. He helped one of the deputies secure the suitcases, watched them count and stack the banded currency with practiced efficiency, and drove home when they told him he was free to go. He dumped his roadside kit in the corner of the workbench, peeled off his jacket, and didn't think about the money again until much later that night, when he reached into the side pocket of the kit for a spare bandage roll and heard something small and hard shift and settle at the bottom of the canvas bag. Delaney Rothwell opened her eyes to a private hospital room, a blood pressure cuff on her left arm, and Gideon Sutter standing at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped behind his back and a look on his face that she had long ago learned to read as controlled management rather than genuine concern. He was 60 with silver hair kept close, and he had served as CFO of Rothwell Meridian Group since before her father died, and she had trusted him the way you trust a piece of infrastructure, completely, and without examining the rivets. Travis Boone, her head of security, stood near the door in a charcoal jacket, thick-necked and watchful, and when Delaney asked what had happened to her vehicle, Gideon told her the onboard system had logged a mechanical failure, a braking anomaly consistent with a software glitch, and that the sheriff's department had impounded the SUV pending a routine examination. When Delaney asked about the 4 suitcases, Travis said the responding officers had inventoried the contents at the scene and confirmed the amounts were intact. The way Gideon then described the man who had found her was careful and precisely calibrated, a local garage operator at the scene alone with 1 suitcase already open by the time the deputies arrived, and the chain of custody for the contents documented only after his presence had been logged. He did not directly accuse Mason Vale of taking anything. He simply arranged the details into a shape that made the accusation available for whoever wanted to pick it up, and then he let the silence do the rest. Delaney knew the technique because she had watched Gideon use it in board meetings for 15 years, and the fact that he was using it now, in her hospital room, about the man who had pulled her out of a wrecked vehicle, told her something she filed away without letting him see. Delaney asked for her phone. Her messages had been cleared by the security team under a standing protocol that Travis had implemented the previous year under the banner of operational privacy, and she had approved it at the time without examining what it would mean when Travis himself was managing the protocol. There was, however, a message that had arrived through the hospital's internal system, brief, unsigned, formatted in the audit shorthand that only one person in the company used regularly. It read, "Ledger locked, decryption asset not in inventory." Maren Blake was the only person who would think to check a police evidence manifest for a decryption asset, and the fact that she had already checked meant she had already understood what Delaney had been carrying and why. Delaney told Gideon she wanted Mason Vale located and formally thanked, and she told Travis directly that no approach was to be coercive, no legal or financial pressure was to be applied, and any contact was to be made through proper channels with full identification presented. Travis confirmed the instruction without blinking. He then left the room, and within 45 minutes, had dispatched 3 men from a private security contractor with no visible affiliation to Rothwell Meridian, but whose operating account ran through a parent company in which Travis held a concealed interest. Delaney didn't know any of that yet. She lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the number the deputy had mentioned in passing. 9,900 and something thousand, and understanding that the something was not a rounding error. 53 miles away, Mason Vale was sanding rust off a brake drum in the back bay of his shop and trying to remember exactly what the woman had said to him in the grass. The 3 men arrived at 11:14 in the morning in a dark sedan with no front plates visible, and they identified themselves to Mason as representatives of Meridian Pacific Insurance, the underwriting firm that covered Rothwell Meridian Group's executive vehicle fleet. The tallest of the 3 handed Mason a business card listing a Chicago address and a toll-free number, printed on thick stock from a professional printer. But when Mason turned it over, he noticed the embossing was on the back rather than the front, which was the opposite of how corporate insurance cards were typically produced, and he filed that detail away without showing he had noticed. The man asked Mason to confirm he had been at the scene of the accident on Route 14 the previous evening, and Mason confirmed it, and the man nodded and said they wanted to ensure all personal items belonging to their client had been recovered. Mason said he had turned over everything at the scene and that the deputies could confirm the inventory. The tall man said they were not concerned with the currency. Those amounts had been reconciled, but that there was a small item, a device that might resemble a memory card or a metal key card, that may have separated from the client's belongings during the accident, and he described it as a thin black rectangle no larger than a standard hotel key with a small symbol on one face. And Mason noticed the man had just provided enough detail to confirm the item was specific and already known to him, which meant he had either seen it before or been briefed on it, neither of which matched the story of a routine insurance recovery. Mason said he hadn't found anything matching that description. The tall man said their records indicated the item had been present in the vehicle, and that it was sensitive corporate property, and that they were prepared to offer Mason a recovery finder's fee of $100,000 in cash, with no documentation required, if he could produce the item within 24 hours. When Mason declined, the man mentioned, in the same tone one might use to discuss a weather forecast, that the note on Mason's garage had moved to accelerated collection status that morning, and that the bank's records showed the new review period when closing in 72 hours rather than the original 2 weeks. The other 2 men had not moved from where they stood near the bay door. Mason set down the wrench he had been holding, crossed to the workbench, and turned on the shop's interior security camera with full deliberate visibility, not hiding the action, but making sure all 3 men could see him make it. He told them that if they represented a legitimate insurance company, they could file a supplemental claim with the sheriff's department and request the evidence manifest, and that any item found in his personal equipment would be turned over through proper channels to whoever could prove legal ownership, and that any further questions about his conduct at the scene could go through his attorney. The tall man looked at him for a moment, and then the 3 of them walked back to the sedan and drove north. After they left, Mason went to the corner of the shop, unzipped the side pocket of his roadside kit, and turned the bag upside down over the workbench. The black card landed among a scatter of zip ties and nitrile gloves. no larger than a hotel key, exactly as described, marked on one face with a small embossed character he didn't immediately recognize. The letter R, followed by a hyphen, followed by the number 17. He stared at it for a long time. Then he called the main switchboard of Rothwell Meridian Group using the number from their public website. The operator transferred him to the Office of Executive Security. The voice that answered was the same voice that had been standing in his garage 40 minutes ago, asking about the device. Mason ended the call before the man could finish his sentence. Fewer than 60 minutes later, his bank called to inform him that his garage loan had been flagged for emergency review at the request of a third-party creditor he had never heard of and couldn't reach. The local newspaper ran the story the following morning under a headline that carefully avoided naming anyone, but included a stock photograph of a tow truck that looked enough like Mason's that 3 of his regular customers recognized it before lunch. The piece described a county mechanic present at the scene of a major accident involving an unnamed executive, and noted that investigators were looking into the possibility that an item of significant value had gone missing during the window between the accident and the arrival of emergency personnel. The story quoted an anonymous source close to the investigation, a phrase that could launder any claim into print, saying that the mechanic had declined to provide investigators with a full inventory of his personal equipment. Mason had done no such thing, had given a complete statement and turned over camera footage voluntarily, but corrections were less interesting than accusations. And by noon 2 customers had called to cancel scheduled appointments, and one had asked, without much subtlety, whether the garage was still going to be operating next month. Mason drove to the county sheriff's office that afternoon with a USB drive containing footage from all 4 of his shop cameras for the previous 36 hours, handed it to the deputy at the desk, gave a supplemental statement, and answered every question asked of him without hedging, because he had nothing to hide about his conduct at the scene, and he understood that the fastest way to stop being treated as a suspect was to behave like someone who knew he wasn't one. He did not mention the R-17 card, because he didn't yet know who controlled the department's communication channels, and because he had spent enough years in a small county to understand that being right about something is only useful if the people listening to you aren't already aligned with the people you're right about. He was back at the garage lying under a Chevrolet pickup with a flashlight in his teeth when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. A Chicago area code, not the one from the fake insurance card. The voice identified itself as Adrian Cole, independent legal counsel, and said 2 sentences that made Mason sit up and hit his head on the frame. The first was a direct quote from the sheriff's incident report that had not been made public, and the second was the exact phrase the woman in the grass had said to him. The 2 words he had thought were about a car key. Adrian explained that Delaney Rothwell had asked him to open with that phrase as a verification signal, because it was the one piece of information that could not have come from anyone who hadn't been lying in the grass beside her. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at a small law firm in Brixton, chosen for its visible waiting room, working alarm system, and 2 exits. Mason drove his regular truck rather than the tow vehicle and parked 2 blocks away out of a habit he couldn't fully explain to himself. Delaney Rothwell arrived in a plain sedan with her right arm in a sling, and she crossed the waiting room toward him with the kind of direct, economical movement that made him think she had spent years in rooms where the first 3 seconds either cost you or saved you. She thanked him. Then, before he could respond, she asked him directly whether he had opened any of the suitcases. The question landed somewhere between his ribs. Mason reached into his jacket, set the R-17 card flat on the table between them, and said that he hadn't touched the money, but he had apparently brought something away by accident, and that before he handed it to anyone, he wanted to understand why 3 men working for the same organization she ran had spent 2 days trying to convince him he hadn't found it. Delaney looked at the card, then looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, but the particular recalibration of someone who has just had a hypothesis confirmed by an unexpected source. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the card caught the light from the window, and a small indicator on its surface, dormant since the accident, blinked once and held steady green. Adrian Cole had established what he called an air-gapped verification room in a converted storage space at the back of the law office. No network connection, no wireless capability, a laptop running a standalone operating system from a clean install, and a biometric scanner sourced independently of any Rothwell Meridian equipment or supply chain. He explained to Mason with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades watching evidence chains break at the worst possible moment, that anything authenticated inside that room would carry a provenance that no one in the Rothwell organization could later claim to have influenced. Marin Blake arrived 20 minutes after Mason, carrying a hard drive in a padded case and looking like someone who hadn't slept properly in 2 days, which she hadn't. She had spent the previous 48 hours reconstructing the audit trail she had been trying to submit through official channels for 7 months. She and Delaney exchanged a look that contained several conversations compressed into about 2 seconds, and then everyone sat down, and Delaney placed her right thumb on the biometric scanner and waited for the system to wake. The encryption released in 3 layers, each requiring both Delaney's biometric and a secondary audit code that Marin entered from her own independently maintained records, and what opened on the laptop screen was the kind of document that takes years to build and about 4 minutes to understand. $312 million had moved through Rothwell Meridian's Rural Infrastructure Fund over a period of 4 years, routed through a chain of 47 shell companies registered across 7 states, each one dissolving before the next audit cycle and reforming under a new name with a new registered agent, but the same underlying ownership structure. The money was supposed to build hospitals in 4 rural counties, repair a state highway corridor, and fund a manufacturing facility that would have employed roughly 900 people in a region where the median household income had declined every year for the previous decade. None of those projects had been completed, and the communities waiting on them had been given explanations ranging from regulatory delay to federal funding shortfalls, explanations that were false and had been constructed specifically to buy time. The money had exited through the last company in the chain into accounts held by an investment vehicle whose name, when Mason saw it on the screen, made him set down his coffee and stare without speaking. The investment vehicle held a controlling interest in a property acquisition firm that had been purchasing land along the projected corridor of a new rail line, land that included 3 parcels in the industrial zone south of Brixton, the same zone where Mason's garage sat on its half-acre lot. He had believed the bank's sudden acceleration of his note was the bad luck of a man with a thin financial margin and a piece of equipment a creditor had decided was easier to sell than to maintain. He understood now that it was a pressure tactic, a way to move a small property holder off a parcel that had been targeted for acquisition at below market value, to be folded into a portfolio that would be sold to the rail project at a markup paying out tens of millions of dollars to whoever controlled the acquiring firm. And the acquiring firm's controlling interest sat, quietly and plainly, in an account connected to Gideon Sutter. Mason told Delaney that he appreciated the offer to settle his garage debt and that he was declining it because he didn't want the money that came from the woman he had helped, and he didn't want it for the same reason he had left $10 million in a ditch 2 weeks ago. Not because he lacked imagination about what it could do, but because the kind of man who collected on a rescue was not the kind of man he had any interest in being. Delaney studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Then Marin scrolled to the next section of the document, and Mason saw Delaney's own name in a digital signature block, below a transfer authorization that had moved $11 million through a company she had never heard of. The timestamp showing it had been executed during a 48-hour window 3 years ago, when she had been managing the collapse of a subsidiary acquisition across 6 time zones at once, signing batches of documents her assistant had flagged as routine approvals. The room went very quiet. Delaney's voice, when she spoke, was level in the way that required effort rather than calm. She said she recognized the signature format because she used the same cryptographic key for all authorization packages, and she said she had no memory of approving a transfer to that company. And she said both of those things knowing that I didn't know what I was signing was not a defense that would hold up in a deposition or a regulatory filing or her own conscience. Gideon had learned her approval patterns over 15 years of proximity. He knew which document windows she trusted her assistant to pre-screen, knew the periods when she was processing 40 or 50 approvals a day across multiple time zones, knew that she read the headline and the total and rarely read page 7 of a 30-page financial instrument when her phone was showing 17 other urgent items. He had designed the fraud to fit inside her blind spots, and she had provided those blind spots to him through years of delegated trust in a man she had never independently verified. Mason did not offer comfort, and he did not soften what he said next, that he had some sympathy for what she was describing, but that the communities whose infrastructure money had been rerouted through those 47 companies did not have the option of citing administrative overload, and that a CEO who controls a $3 billion organization carries a different kind of accountability than the mechanics and drivers and nurses whose towns were supposed to be built with that money, and that accountability did not disappear because the mechanism of deception was sophisticated. Delaney listened to him without interrupting, and when he finished she said he was right. Adrian outlined the legal path, a complete evidence package delivered through proper chain of custody to federal financial investigators, with Delaney as a cooperating party rather than a target, requiring transparency about her own governance failures and the unauthorized authorization packages, all of this executed before Gideon could construct a preemptive narrative that cast him as the subordinate and her as the architect. The window was narrow, days at most, possibly hours, and it would almost certainly result in a period of mandatory administrative leave while the investigation ran, meaning she could lose operational control of the company she had spent her adult life running. Delaney asked Adrian what the alternative was. Adrian said there wasn't one worth taking. While Adrian and Delaney worked through the documentation requirements, Mason went to the front window and looked across the street without any particular reason except that looking at things carefully was a habit that had served him well. A dark blue coupe was parked at the meter outside the coffee shop directly opposite the law firm. It had been there when he arrived. The driver hadn't gotten out. The engine was still running. He could see the exhaust. And the driver's side mirror was angled toward the firm's entrance rather than toward oncoming traffic, which was not how you positioned a mirror for a parallel park entry. Mason didn't announce what he had noticed. He photographed the vehicle and plate through the window glass, crossed to Adrian's desk, and said quietly that they should finish what they needed and leave through the back. Adrian moved without asking questions. Marin compressed the drive. Delaney pocketed the R17 card, and they exited through the rear hall while Mason went to the front and left an envelope in the outgoing mail basket at the reception desk. The envelope contained a single folded sheet of paper with the word "copy" written on it in pencil, and the actual drive was in his jacket. When the dark coupe's driver entered the building 3 minutes later, the combination safe in the back office was open, and it was empty, and the security camera above the safe had been recording for the last 40 minutes. The news piece appeared the following morning under a Rothwell Meridian corporate communications byline that had cultivated enough relationships with regional finance desks to get its statements run as reported story rather than corporate press release. It described a protected class whistleblower situation in which a company executive was allegedly being coerced by an outside party who had illegally retained proprietary corporate data and was leveraging it for personal financial gain. Mason Vale was not named. He was described as a person of interest who had been present at the scene of an executive vehicle incident and had subsequently failed to return a device documented on the vehicle's equipment manifest. The piece used phrases like ongoing investigation and law enforcement cooperation in ways that implied an investigation was already active and law enforcement had been briefed, neither of which was true. At 7:18 the same morning, Mason's business account received an incoming wire transfer from a company called Meridian Rural Services, LLC, $250,000. Arriving in a single transaction with no memo line and no accompanying documentation. Mason called his bank immediately, told them to freeze the account, and filed a suspicious activity report before he had finished his first cup of coffee. He photographed the transfer confirmation and sent it to Adrian with a one-line message. They moved first. He knew what the transfer was, not a payment, not a bribe, but a brushstroke. The first line of a picture that would show a working-class mechanic who had received a large sum from a company he claimed to be exposing. Adrian confirmed within the hour that Meridian Rural Services LLC appeared on page 31 of the R17 ledger as a subsidiary within Gideon's core shell structure. That same afternoon, Sadie called on her own, which meant she was worried, because when she wasn't worried, she let calls go to 4 or 5 rings out of some teenage principal about not seeming too reachable. She said she had seen things being said about her father, and that they didn't seem right, and Mason told her the people saying them didn't have the full picture, and that he was handling it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked not whether he had taken anything but whether he was safe. A different question, and a more important one, and Mason said yes, and meant it as best he could. He told her he had left $10 million in a drainage ditch because he wanted to be able to look at her without having to look away, and she said that was very annoying of him, and she was glad. Later that day, Delaney issued a public statement through her personal channel, brief, factual, verified, confirming that Masonvale had found her, rendered assistance, cooperated fully with law enforcement, and had at no point solicited or received compensation from her or her organization. She described him as a person of basic decency in a situation that had not made decency easy. The statement cost her exactly what she had calculated it would. Within 4 hours, a faction of the Rothwell board called an emergency session citing executive conduct inconsistent with the CEO's contractual communications protocol. Gideon Sutter, who had spent 20 years cultivating 3 of the 5 board members in that faction, seconded the motion to hold the vote without further delay. Then the following evening, he quietly circulated a 12-second clip of security footage from a private airfield to 3 board members. Footage showing Delaney loading 4 suitcases into an SUV without any law enforcement escort, and conveyed through an intermediary that if she didn't step down before the scheduled vote, he would make the footage available to federal regulators and let them draw their own conclusions. The video was real, and Delaney told Adrian and Mason both that she had no intention of pretending otherwise. It showed her at the airfield, alone, carrying suitcases that contained $10 million in cash, and there was no amount of framing that would make 12 seconds look like what it actually was. A CEO intercepting her own CFO's illegal payout at a private handoff, while still trying to determine whether anyone in her security apparatus could be trusted. The footage had been cut at frame 36, right before the camera angle shifted to show the man she had followed there, and the timestamp that established her arrival as 8 seconds after his vehicle had pulled in. Whoever had cut it knew exactly where to stop. Gideon's terms, delivered through an attorney with no Rothwell affiliation, were simple. Resign before the board vote, issue a statement attributing her departure to personal reasons, accept a 12-month advisory contract binding her by a non-disclosure clause broad enough to cover everything she knew about the ledger and the rural fund diversion. And in exchange, the video would be withdrawn. Masonvale would be left alone, and the public-facing organization would remain stable. Mason listened to the terms read back by Adrian and said what he thought without adjusting it for the room. The man who had arranged a vehicle malfunction on a rural highway was now offering a guarantee that the mechanic who found the wreck would be left in peace, and the question was how much anyone believed a guarantee from a person who arranged vehicle malfunctions. Delaney said she wasn't considering it. Mason said that was the right answer, and that he was not saying so because he trusted her judgment without reservation. He had known her for less than a week, but because he had spent those days watching her reckon honestly with her own failures, and that was not the behavior pattern of someone who had been running a fraud from the top. He said this while recalking a window frame in the back of his shop because he did not stop working during conversations, and somehow the combination of what he was saying and the tool in his hand made the words easier to receive than they might otherwise have been. Marin had spent the previous night compiling 14 months of blocked audit reports, cross-referencing every internal filing she had submitted that had been returned from Gideon's office with notations citing timing, materiality thresholds, or procedural irregularities. 17 of them, every single one blocked before reaching the CEO's floor, which meant Delaney had made genuine governance errors, but had also been deliberately isolated from the corrections those errors might have prompted. Adrian assembled the final evidence package with all 3 sets of documents, the biometric authentication logs, the camera footage from the law office safe, and the banking records showing the origin of the $250,000 transfer, and had it ready for transmission to federal investigators through a secure, verified channel. Before the package was sealed, Travis Boone sent a message to Adrian's private contact number. He said he needed to speak. He said Gideon was moving $90 million offshore that same evening, during the vote, and that he had not understood until 48 hours ago what the complete shape of the plan had been or how far it extended. The Rothwell Meridian Board convened in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower in Chicago. Dark wood paneling, 12 leather chairs, a view of the lake that was both beautiful and entirely beside the point. Gideon arrived with 2 advisors and a presentation that had been designed by someone who understood how to construct a coherent story from partial facts, and he laid out his account of Mason Vale with the confidence of a man who had been building toward this moment for months. He described Mason as a working-class man with significant personal debt who had been present at a sensitive financial event, had retained corporate property without authorization, and had subsequently entered a coercive arrangement with the sitting CEO to use that property as leverage against the board's legitimate authority. He said it without raising his voice, with supporting slides and clear chronology, and he knew before he sat down that 3 of the 12 people in the room had made up their minds before he walked in. Mason did not give a speech. He had driven up from Brixton that morning in his work truck, and he stood at the end of the table with printed documentation and said what the physical evidence showed, starting with the SUV's crash data recorder. The braking system's failure signature was consistent with a remote override using a factory maintenance code that bypassed driver input, a code issued only to authorized service vendors and fleet security contractors, and the specific code used had been accessed 8 minutes before the accident from a device registered to the Rothwell Meridian Security Operations account, whose administrative login belonged to Travis Boone. Travis had provided this in a sworn cooperating statement, along with internal communications showing Gideon had requested confirmation that Delaney's vehicle would be intercepted before she reached her destination. The gala of documentation that followed, Marin's 17 blocked audit reports, the R-17 ledger opened before the board's independent oversight committee, the shell company structure mapped from first transfer to last. It took 40 minutes to walk through, and by the end of it the room had a different quality of silence than it had started with. Adrian transmitted the full evidence package to federal investigators during the board's legal recess, time-stamped and chain of custody verified. Travis appeared by secure video link and confirmed under oath that the instruction to retrieve the device had come directly from Gideon, that the men who had visited Mason's garage were deployed under his authorization, and that the $250,000 transfer to Mason's account had been processed through a Meridian subsidiary on Gideon's direct instruction. The board moved to freeze all discretionary transfers above $100,000, and the freeze request reached the Financial Operations Center at 9:47 in the evening. 16 minutes before a scheduled wire of $90 million was set to leave through a correspondent banking chain that would have made tracing the funds a multi-year international effort. The wire was canceled with 9 minutes to spare. Gideon sat at the far end of the table during the suspension vote and said one last thing before the result was announced. That Delaney Rothwell had been CEO during every year the fund diversions had occurred, that her signature appeared on authorization documents across all 4 fiscal years, and that the board's fiduciary duty ran to the facts and not to a narrative. He was not wrong about her signature being there. He was not wrong that she had been in charge. The suspension vote was 14-1. Delaney asked the board before she left the room to defer the question of her continued leadership until the federal investigation had concluded and an independent governance review had been completed, not as a negotiating position, but as a statement of what she believed the circumstances required. She said that using her family name or her majority shareholder position to resist an oversight process that any other executive would face was exactly the kind of governance failure that had allowed 4 years of fraud to continue under her watch, and that she was not willing to be shielded from accountability by the same structural advantages that had shielded the fraud. The board member who had seconded Gideon's earlier motion looked at her across the table and seemed, for a moment, to be reconsidering several things at once. Federal investigators moved within 48 hours, and the charges filed against Gideon Sutter covered wire fraud, securities fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and, based on the crash data recorder evidence and the maintenance code access log, criminal tampering with a motor vehicle. The last charge was the one that made the national financial press treat the story as something more than a dry regulatory matter, because it meant the CFO of a $3 billion organization had made a decision that could have killed someone on a rural Kentucky highway in order to protect a scheme that had been stealing from hospital construction budgets. Travis Boone was charged with conspiracy, unlawful surveillance, and coercive intimidation. His cooperation agreement reduced but did not eliminate his exposure, and he had understood from his first conversation with Adrian that it wouldn't. The $250,000 that had appeared in Mason's account was formally documented as an evidence-planting attempt and was returned to federal custody as exhibit material. The $10 million from the accident scene remained in federal custody as part of the ongoing case, to be returned to the Rural Infrastructure Fund along with whatever else could be recovered from the shell company chain. The property acquisition campaign targeting land along the rail corridor was suspended pending a full review of how the parcels had been accumulated, and the forced acceleration notice on Mason's garage loan was withdrawn when the bank determined that the original escalation request had originated from an entity now under federal investigation. Mason's debt did not disappear. His garage still owed $62,000 to the bank, which was a real number representing real months of work, and he had no interest in pretending the problem had solved itself. Delaney offered to settle it again, sitting across from him in a coffee shop near the Brixton County line, and he declined again, and she said she respected the answer and also found it somewhat exhausting, and Mason said that was fair. He proposed instead that Vale County Auto and Recovery submit a competitive bid for a fleet maintenance contract covering Rothwell Meridian's regional vehicle pool across rural Kentucky and southern Illinois, the contract to be awarded through a public tender with third-party oversight, at market rate, with no preferential terms that could later be characterized as compensation or influence. Delaney said she would instruct the procurement office to run the tender. Mason said that was all he was asking. She studied him across the table for a moment and asked why a man who had just helped dismantle a scheme that had nearly cost him everything would want to work with the company at the center of it. Mason said he didn't want to work with Rothwell Meridian. He wanted to work for the drivers who ran delivery routes through 3 counties, the repair crews who kept rural ambulance fleets functional, the small municipalities whose vehicle pools were serviced by whoever bid lowest rather than whoever did the work properly. He said the company was a funding mechanism, and he was agnostic about its ownership structure. But the trucks still needed their brakes checked, and the people who drove them still went home to families at the end of a shift, and he was good at making sure the mechanical components of that arrangement didn't fail on a backcountry highway. Delaney listened and didn't say anything for a long time. The federal investigation ran for 14 months. The independent governance review ran alongside it and produced a restructured board with mandatory rotation cycles, a protected internal audit channel reporting to an external oversight committee, and a formal policy separating financial authorization from executive approval in all transactions above $250,000. The Rural Fund Recovery Program identified 42 communities that had been deprived of promised infrastructure investment and established a restitution schedule funded by the liquidation of Gideon's personal holdings and shell company assets, which turned out to include the land parcels along the rail corridor, the same ones he had been accumulating on his own behalf while authorizing the project that would buy them back at a premium. Mason won the fleet maintenance tender on the merits of his bid, hired 2 additional mechanics, and paid down the garage debt from operating revenue over 11 months without shortcuts, which meant the process was slower and less dramatic than anyone might have written it. Sadie moved back into the apartment above the shop, which Mason had spent 3 weekends repainting and furnishing with actual furniture, rather than the folding table and camping cot that had served as the previous decor. She spent Saturday afternoons helping with dispatch and had strong opinions about the parts inventory organization that Mason pretended to resist and then quietly implemented over the course of about 2 weeks. Delaney was reinstated as CEO 14 months after her voluntary leave, following the completion of the federal review and the board's adoption of the new governance structure. She did not attend her own reinstatement ceremony. She drove herself to Brixton in a plain sedan, no security detail, no assistant, and pulled into the Vale County Auto and Recovery lot on a Saturday morning when the garage was busy, the radio was on, and Mason was lying under a chassis with his feet sticking out into the bay. She waited on the bench beside the door until he had finished. When he came out, she handed him a coffee from the place down the road, and they stood in the lot and talked about nothing consequential for a while. The way people do when they have already said the consequential things and don't need to repeat them. She asked him, eventually, whether he had ever, in that moment on the rural highway standing over $10 million in the failing light, considered taking even a single bundle from one of those open suitcases. Mason said yes. He said the thought had been present for exactly the 2 seconds it took him to understand the full price of it. He looked past her at Sadie, who was painting the shop's name back onto the wooden sign above the bay door, the letters still wet and careful and precisely spaced, and he said, if he had reached for that money, he could have bought himself out of every debt he owed. But the one thing he couldn't have purchased back was the father his daughter still believed him to be. Delaney didn't answer. She looked at the sign above the bay door, and then at the man standing beside her, and understood something she suspected she had been learning since the moment she opened her eyes in a roadside ditch and found a stranger applying pressure to her injuries instead of filling his pockets. That the real choice Mason Vale had made on that Kentucky road was never between a woman and a pile of money. It was between an easy life and the ability to look his daughter in the eye, and he had made it in the 2 seconds before he even turned around.